and Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi guys, and welcome back to the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss different ways of eating. So we're going to be breaking down macros versus meal plans versus intuitive eating.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really interesting one just because we have a lot of people who come to ask us for meal plans and we turn them down for a variety of reasons. And in addition, I find myself transitioning a lot of clients from, say, macro tracking to a more I don't like using the words intuitive eating because there's actually like a clinical practice for intuitive eating, but a more mindful eating and less tracking based approach. And so I think we're really going to discuss this as a spectrum because it really goes from how rigid you're being with your nutrition from one end of the spectrum to another. And so meal plans are on one end. Intuitive / mindful eating is going to be on the other, and macro tracking kind of lies in the middle depending on where you take it. And I think it'll be really interesting to explore this entire spectrum and give you guys a full picture as to why we typically use macro tracking with clients, but also the pros and cons of things like meal plans and intuitive eating, mindful eating, etc.
Yeah, and we have definitely touched on this topic before. I think actually it's like a theme throughout our podcast, like the idea of balance and like that maintenance mindset and the idea of that flexible versus accurate. So we've touched on this a lot, but I think that this is really going to break down kind of like not the pros and cons, but really dive into each one and be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one thing that you actually just made me think of was in our interview with Eric Helms, the balance between flexibility and accuracy, or the trade-off between those two. So basically, what we're going to be getting at today is the more accurate that you are with your nutrition, the less flexible you will be. The more flexible you are, therefore the less accurate you will be. And so you have to basically give and take with those two factors. And you're basically, I mean, most people try to find what their middle ground is, but you have to also acknowledge, depending on what you're doing, what your goals are, what phase you're in, how flexible you can be and how accurate you need to be in order to see the results that you want. And so starting on the accurate end of the spectrum, I guess we'll start talking about meal plans. So, I mean, what is a meal plan?
Yeah, so a meal plan is a very structured way of eating. So typically what will happen is, so Marissa, I guess before kind of to backtrack, Marissa said one of the reasons we don't offer meal plans and one of the big reasons we don't offer meal plans is because it is technically illegal for us to do that as online fitness coaches because we are not registered dietitians. They are the only ones that are legally allowed to write meal plans. And typically what happens with a meal plan is it's like, okay, for meal 1, meal 2, meal 3, meal 4, like this is what you eat. Here are the exact measurements. And you're not really supposed to or like allowed to deviate from that day of eating. And they might give you like a few alternatives here and there. But a lot of people who follow meal plans, it is typically those who are, I feel like it's mostly for like medical reasons.
Yeah. And I think too, it can also be like a list of approved foods and serving sizes. So maybe it's not a written out like meal 1 cup of rice, 4 ounces of chicken, a cup of spinach. Like it might not be exactly that, but maybe you have a list of approved foods and they say you need to eat 3 to 5 times per day. And at each meal, you need to have one from each of these approved food groups type of things. So it's very much like you have yeses and nos, you have good and bad foods, you have the things that you're allowed to eat and the things that you're not allowed to eat. And by nature, these plans just cut out pretty much all processed food. They cut out pretty much anything that could be potentially considered quote unquote bad food. And so it makes it really, really easy to fall off the plan essentially, because if you don't have access to those exact foods, then where does your mind go if you're not able to follow that, right? Like you pretty much are like, okay, well, I'm off the diet, right?
Right. And I think the other thing too is it's easier to fall off in the sense that if you go to a restaurant and you can't eat your exact meal 3, then you're like, well, what do I do? Because I can't order this food. So some people might just go, well, F it, I'm just going to eat whatever. But at the same time, having a meal plan is kind of almost easier to follow in the sense that it's very rigid. There are rules. There's no black and white, or there's no gray area. It's very black and white. It's very structured. So at the same time, it's like, well, I know exactly what I need to eat to reach my goal. There's kind of no, well, I don't know, or should I eat this? Oh my gosh, my animals are going crazy right now in the room. They're like moving my ring light around. But yeah, so it's just, I have a lot of people who are like, well, I don't do well with macros because I just need something to follow. Just tell me what to eat. And so it is understandable because they want something with structure. And I know that sometimes you and I have felt that way in the past, that we want this rigidity. We want this, just, I don't know, something that's just easy to follow. So I understand why people might want that approach kind of like in the beginning, but it is hard to stick to it weeks and months later.
Yeah, and I think the main thing with that is it allows you not to think. And that's what people want, right? Like they come to us and they say, I don't do well with these things that make me, have to critically think about the food that I'm putting in my body. I want to follow this because it doesn't teach me anything. So I don't have to actively learn about what's in my food. I can just follow what's on the paper. And while that works for a lot of people who can get under that mindset of like, oh, just do what's on the paper, that's great. But ultimately, if you don't understand what's going on and why that plan is working, then what's the purpose if you're not going to be able to sustain those results, right? Because once you finish your diet, once you go off the plan, then what do? You don't have any sort of knowledge or guidance other than that meal plan specifically on how to eat. Maybe have even stronger associations with good and bad foods. So that whole not thinking thing is a very double-edged sword, because yes, there are times and places where maybe you just need to not think. And I think a lot of times, and personally, I've gone back to more of a meal plan structure when I'm in contest prep, because it's like at that point I have no mental energy, I need to not think. But that's after I've built all the foundational knowledge. So I really don't like to start people off with meal plans, because it's illegal, and just so you know, there are lots of people who are not registered dietitians who give meal plans, and they are doing so either without the knowledge that they're doing it illegally, or just ignoring it altogether. But so I don't like to start people off there, because critically thinking through what you're putting in your body, learning how to make appropriate decisions in different contexts, that shit's important. And like, it's just, I get it. I do get it. And I understand the appeal of not wanting to think and just being able to just go through something robotically and make progress, but that doesn't bring you any value. And so I, like you said, I understand where it comes from, but it really does kind of just bite you in the ass in the end, even if it's successful up front. And I think that's really the main downside.
Yeah. So I like what you said about, meal plans don't really teach you much. And that's huge. That's one of the big reasons that I don't like using them, especially for a beginner, because when you, oh my gosh, oh, I need to take my animals out of the room. Yeah. Sorry, they were going behind this like huge mirror and I just knew that they were gonna knock it over.
Yeah, that could be bad. You can just pick up, we'll edit it.
Yeah. But one of the things I like that you said was talking about how meal plans don't really teach you much. And again, that is 100% true, because I think that what happens is I'll have clients who come to me and they're like, well, I'm not following macros, but I'm following this meal plan that I got like 3 years ago. And like you could have a meal plan that was written for you and even like 2 months prior, and it doesn't make sense for what your current goals are or where you are now. So again, it doesn't really teach you much. It doesn't teach you how to manipulate your food for different goals. It's just kind of like, this is what you need to eat right now. So the idea of macros is, and this is kind of, sometimes I'll meet clients in the middle and I'm like, okay, so you don't really want to track macros, but what you can do and what I can kind of help you with in the beginning is I'm giving you macros, you create your own meal plan. So plug in, the day before, and figure out what you want to, what you want to eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and kind of work something out. And then if you want to stick to that, you stick with it for the entire week. So you wrote yourself a meal plan. And if going into the next week, if you don't like it, or if something didn't work, you can change it and make adjustments, but you're in control of it. And you're still learning about food, you're creating it yourself. And then if you start to, if you want some flexibility, you can go in and kind of adjust throughout the day, or, it's kind of like throwing an audible, like if you want to go out to dinner, that you're allowed to adjust it and you don't have to stick to it 100%, but you do have that structure if you really like and enjoy that.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think so, just giving people a little bit more context on, okay, we're moving along the spectrum here. So we've gone from meal plans and now we're moving into, okay, what is macro tracking? So essentially, macro tracking is counting your grams of carbs, fat, and protein. If you don't have background in this already, then you should listen to our macros 101 episode, because we go through exactly how to set yourself up with macros, how to count them, everything about them. But essentially, you have targets in a number of grams per day for each macronutrient target. So you'll have a protein goal, a carb goal, and a fat goal. And this can be a singular number target. I often give my clients ranges. So there might be a 10 to 20 gram range of carbs and protein that I want them to fall within, or maybe a 10-gram range of fat that I have them fall within. So that kind of opens up a little bit more flexibility. But essentially, you'll have some number targets, and pretty much anything technically goes in that. So like if you wanted to fit a donut into those numbers, you could. If you wanted to just eat chicken and rice, you could. And so basically you can make it what you want, and macros are ultimately what you make it in terms of mindset as well. So we'll get into that, but essentially just giving you a little bit more context. So it is a plan, it is a structure, but how you divvy that up and how you treat it is essentially up to you. And so that meal plan from macros is more so on that still more rigid side of the spectrum. So we are being more accurate because you're repeating the same thing every single day, but you do have control over it, and it is forcing you to learn, okay, well, if I want to hit my macros, what foods do I need? What foods fit within those constraints? And it forces you to go through that critical thinking process. So I've also done this with clients before too, where maybe we've sat down on a Zoom call and we've actually built out a meal plan with the macros. That is not illegal because the client is choosing their own foods and has the ability to change that. But yeah, so that's one really good way to kind of get them in the door there. Personally, I do that when I'm cutting, especially. So especially these past 12 weeks. So right now I'm starting my reverse diet, so a little bit more flexible day to day. But when I was cutting, I didn't want to think about food. So I literally would copy and paste every single meal. So my whole day of eating, I would just literally use the copy and paste feature from day to day to day. And then if I ran out of a certain food, for example, ran out of blackberries, so I added more blueberries to my breakfast because I do like a berry medley. So I would just change the amounts as needed if I ran out, but otherwise it would stay exactly the same. And so for me, that really works when I'm dieting down because I just hate thinking about it. But that's because I also have the knowledge of what is in every single food that I'm eating. And I didn't go that whole cut eating that every single day. I also ate out. I also took some audibles and, really made things work no matter where I was at, because I had that built-in flexibility with the numbers. So if I went out and had, for example, on my birthday weekend, we went to a brewery and we got a flight of samples, and I was able to have a couple of those within my macros. And so that is kind of one personal example of how you can be rigid, but also move towards flexibility with that structure.
Yeah. And again, like Marissa and I have mentioned throughout all these different episodes, is we started out as beginners too. And we were overwhelmed by the amount of information. And there were days where we messed up our numbers, like probably pretty badly, because we figured out that we tracked something wrong. We didn't change the amount that we had. Something we did stupid things when we were tracking. And so what I tell my clients is, I want progress, not perfection. So just because you mess up your macros one day, you get to start over the next day and just kind of restart and learn from your mistakes. So we had to do that macro Tetris at the end of the night, trying to figure out what would fit. And then there are times where you're like, well, I blew my fat, so I need to find something with only carbs and only protein. Like, what can I do? So we've done that. And there are still times where, like, at the end of the night, I'm like, oh, like, I don't want to think about this. But you have a weird knowledge base, like you have a weird amount of nutritional information in your head that you can just kind of like come up with things. But it happened over time. It wasn't just like, oh, boom, like I know macros right away. That it was just a gradual learning process, and it's not as difficult for us anymore. But we did start off as beginners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about tracking macros. In my opinion, it's the fact that it forces you to learn things. Now, like I said at the beginning of talking about macros are ultimately what you make it. So you can make it as black and white as you want, or you can make it a sustainable framework for the long term. And what I mean by that is, if you say, for example, maybe you fall on that rigid side of the spectrum and you do eat, your meal plan that you made with macros, and you basically don't deviate from that. Or if you decide that, you can only eat quote unquote clean foods, which no one even knows what that means. But like, let's say you decide you can only eat non-processed food within your macros. And, if you go off of that, and I've had clients do this, they set the expectation for themselves up that even though they're tracking macros, they can't have any quote unquote junk food. And so they basically still have this black and white all or nothing mindset of like, oh, well, I can't have this food within my macros because it's bad, and all of these preconceived notions that we have. Or, you can make it as black and white as you want with your mindset towards adherence. So like Christina was saying, we want progress, not perfection in our clients. So if they mess up their macros a little bit, it's okay. We'd rather they just start fresh the next day. But oftentimes what happens if they're not guided properly, they will go over, like, let's say your carb goal is 200 grams of carbs, and you go over by 2 grams, like 202 for the day. And you say, oh, I was over, I messed up, I might as well just, screw it, whatever, I'm off the plan. So you can still have that mindset of being on and off the plan with macros. That's still there. But what we want is to move away from that mindset of rigidity of like, you're either on and off the plan, towards more flexibility of, well, this is actually pretty fluid, right? Like your body doesn't know the difference between 200 and 202 grams of carbs, or even 200 and 210. It just knows what's coming in and it's digesting as food comes in. And, maybe that day that you went over your macros, it's because you worked out extra hard and you were super active. So maybe you did need a little bit more fuel that day. This is all kind of fluid. And the whole purpose of tracking your macros is to understand what's in the food that you eat, what portions look like, how to portion those properly for your body and your activity needs, and notice how these things change either as your body weight changes, your activity level changes, your training changes, or as your body composition changes. So your macros are constantly changing. They're fluid day to day. you can quote unquote mess up, but still not have it really affect anything, And so I think moving away from that, oh, well, I was 2 grams over on my fat, so I'm a failure. We want to move away from that mindset when it comes to macros. And that's what we try to do with our coaching. But it's really hard because it's still a target. It's still something that we strive to, be adherent with. We want to be adherent. But at the same time, we have to know, how rigid is too rigid and what is healthy versus unhealthy for our own mental state with this approach.
Right. So there are so many things that I was thinking of while you're talking. And so one of them that I was thinking is that macro tracking is a tool. And so we like to implement it to help you learn more about nutrition, what you need to actually eat to reach your goals, and and we've mentioned this before, what you don't track, you can't measure. So for example, if a client says, well, I think I'm getting enough protein. Okay, well, if they are, 140 pounds and they're only eating 50 to 60 grams every day, they're not eating enough protein, but they wouldn't know that unless they started tracking their intake. And for Marissa and I to be able to manipulate someone's intake, we need to kind of know where they're at, how we can manipulate. And oftentimes what happens is we have clients who want to lose weight, and the first thing that we do is increase their food, because there's nothing we can really do if they're only eating 1,000 calories a day, which happens a lot more frequently than we would like. But in order for you to understand, wow, I actually need to eat a lot more food than I thought, that kind of just gives you a better idea, rather than just being like, well, I don't know what I'm eating. I don't know what I need to eat. So it's not the goal to track your macros the rest of your life. And we've talked about this before. You don't want to be, 60, 70, 80 years old, getting out your food scale at restaurants and tracking your food. The idea is to just have this base of knowledge, and you have an idea. And again, you don't have to be super stringent. It's super stringent, super rigid with your macros, but you just have a better understanding. You're more mindful of what you're eating throughout the day. But the other thing that I was thinking of while you're talking was, while macros can kind of feel like you have this huge freedom, like there's nothing that is off limits, there's no good or bad food, it can sometimes still feel restrictive, in the sense that, like, let's say you come home and you really want to eat an entire pizza, and then you plug it into your food and you're like, oh no, I can't eat this entire pizza. Like, I still need to eat protein. Like things like that. So you might only be able to eat like 1 or 2 slices, and it might feel restrictive because you want to eat way more than that. And then after that, you also want ice cream, and you also want this. And so macros is not, you can't just, for most people, eat whatever you want for every single meal. There are still principles that you need to follow. So there are people who do feel like it can be restrictive at times. But in order to reach your goals, there are certain habits that you need to implement every single day, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. And you just opened up a huge string of thoughts for me too. So I'm going to go off of what you were saying. And when you were saying, people who say, oh, well, I think I'm getting enough protein, or I think I'm eating enough, I really just don't like those conversations. And it's always with like the late high school or college age male, where that conversation really pisses me off, because
I can't gain weight.
It's like, I can't gain weight, or like, I feel like I'm eating enough, but I'm just not gaining weight. And I'm like, okay, cool. How many calories are you eating per day? And they go, oh, about 2,500, about 3,000, about 4,000, whatever. I'm eating so much. Or like, I don't track, but I just know I'm eating enough because I feel sick all the time. And I'm like, is that true? Or do you just forget to eat all day and then have a really big meal at night that makes you feel like crap? Right. And so then
I was thinking it's like a reel where it's like, I think I'm eating enough. Do you actually eat enough? Those reels.
That's a good one. I'm going to steal that. But yeah, so it's like, of course, like, you think you're eating enough because of maybe ways that you feel about food, but if you don't have that knowledge, how are you supposed to know? And so when those people actually track their intake, it's like, oh shit, I'm actually eating way less than I thought I was. And so I've had this happen with a couple of male clients who I did some consultations with, and I was like, hey, like, I just need this data from you. So you said you've been tracking, so like send me over your data. And one of the guys was like, got it, sends over the Excel. And he was like, it's blank because I actually wasn't tracking my food. I just thought I was. And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but, but clearly you're not eating enough from what you've described.
Yeah.
Another thing you made me think of too is one of the things that kind of airs us towards that side of being more flexible with macro tracking that meal plans don't teach us is how do we, and it's like the pizza example, how do we become flexible and implement moderation? Meal plans can't teach us that because it's either you're on the plan or you're having a cheat meal or you've fallen off the diet, right? And it's very, very much like those are the only three options. But like we said, there's this new sense of kind of freedom with tracking macros that sometimes people can take too far. I mean, you can take anything too far, but essentially, like you could go with an anything goes approach. Like if you wanted to eat donuts and drink your protein from protein shakes and egg whites all day long, you could theoretically do that. You'd feel like crap, but you could do that, right? And so when it comes to tracking macros, you actually learn not just, okay, I can eat this indulgent thing, but also how does it fit into the context of my day? Because if I do have that donut, what needs to give, right? If I do have, for example, a fattier meat like a ribeye or a salmon for lunch, what needs to give later in the day? Maybe I can't have 3 whole eggs. Maybe I need to have egg whites instead. Or maybe I can't have that chicken thigh. I need to have chicken breast when I go out for dinner. And so that is like the trade-off that you learn of like, okay, well, how do I actually implement this moderation thing to work for me? And then if you're able to fit those things in, say, your fatty meat or a chocolate chip cookie or a piece of cake, you understand where the trade-offs need to happen in order for you to either reach your goals moving forward or just not see any backwards progress, right? So that's what that teaches you. And the final thing you made me think of, go ahead, interrupt.
I was going to say, so I think sometimes that people have a misunderstanding of macros because of what they see on social media. And this is something that we have definitely talked about in the past, but I think sometimes like you have influencers, you have Fitspos that go about their day and they track macros, but they only post their like sexy meal. So they only like post the Pop-Tarts that they eat and, their intra-workout candy and their like big macro bowl at the end of the night. But then what they're not showing you throughout the day is maybe they had like an egg white omelet. They had, chicken and rice and broccoli for lunch, and they don't really post their like not sexy meals. They're like their boring meals throughout the day. And so you think you're like, wow, like all they eat is Pop-Tarts or all they eat is pizza, or they only show what they eat on the weekends. And so you have this like, you look at them and you're like, why can't I eat that? Or I can't fit that into my macros all the time. And so it can be really confusing because they're not showing you everything that they eat, or maybe even the amount of cardio that they have to do in order to maintain their physique. So sometimes it can be difficult to really have an understanding of what someone actually eats throughout the day to reach their goals. And then there are those like anomalies who just can eat everything and anything and they never gain weight. But for the majority of us, that's not the case.
Yeah, for sure. And then the final thing you did make me think of is like the person that says, well, macros didn't work for me because X, Y, and Z. And, I think a lot of times there are, unfortunately, shitty macro coaches out there or diet coaches who use macros, and they still, there are still coaches out there who just want other people to be their success stories. So what they'll do is they'll say, oh, like, food freedom, like you can use this flexible dieting approach and like I will get you to where you want to be. But then they give you macros that are like so low that there's no way you can fit anything like in that without being absolutely miserable. And so yes, those people see results, but it's almost as bad as like a meal plan or fat dieting, because macros at very low calories are something that you need to build up knowledge about before you actually do. And so, excuse me. And so like with that, low calorie macros are very restrictive by nature, because if you want to feel full whatsoever, you have to eat tons and tons of fibrous fruits and vegetables. You have to eat lean protein sources, and it's going to end up looking like a, a bro meal plan, right? And so there's not a lot of moderation built into that. There's not a lot of flexibility built into that. If you want to have an alcoholic beverage with some macros like that, with maybe 100 carbs in your day, then good luck, trying to stick to those numbers for the rest of the day once you've had one drink. Like, it is very, very easy to fall off in that sense too. And so when I have someone telling me, oh, well, macros didn't work for me, and I've had this conversation a number of times in the past, I'll counter that with, well, what were the numbers? What were the macros? And oftentimes I cringe at how low they were. It's like, just ungodly numbers of calories. And I'm like, well, then you weren't really tracking macros. You were just kind of starving. Like, I'm sorry, like that's not what this should be about. It should be about learning how much to actually eat to fuel your body. And when you're eating the amount that you should be, there is room for implementing moderation. Whether that's a little room or a lot of room depends on your lifestyle, activity level, and your metabolism. But there is more room, and it is much, much, much more doable and can be enjoyable too.
Yeah. And one thing that you just made me think of is, for a lot of people who come to us and say, well, macros didn't work for me, they might have tried it for 2 to 3 weeks. And again, their macros are maybe all over the place. And so they didn't see any results and they give up. And that's a conversation I have with a lot of my clients when we have our consultation calls. Is they're like, well, normally what happens is I'll try something for a couple weeks and it doesn't work. And then I just revert back to my old ways of eating. So I thought that macro tracking didn't work for me. And the other thing too is, and again, we've talked about this before, but there are some times where we'll have clients just stick with the same numbers for months. I have a client right now who is postpartum and she has lost, I think like 15 pounds, and we haven't adjusted her macros at all. And at one point she was like, hey, I think that my body like isn't responding to these. Can we like cut my food and not my cardio? And I was like, no. we're not doing that, because you are seeing progress. Like if you look at your average weight. And she's like, oh, okay. And then we continued to lose more weight. So sometimes just sticking with something for a prolonged period of time, even if you don't feel like you're making progress, sometimes you just need to give it a little bit more time. And I think that, again, that goes into setting the expectations and what you can expect from tracking macros, what is realistic in terms of progress that you can make. And as much as we do want progress to happen in 2-3 weeks, sometimes you can't really see things until like week 8, week 9. And that's really hard to invest into something that you feel like you're not really seeing any changes. So I think that's part of the reason that it's so super helpful to have a coach and you have someone who's kind of watching over your protocols, taking in all your biofeedback and your data points, and can let you know like, hey, I am seeing progress, or hey, I expect to see progress here soon. So that's kind of my little rant on like macros not working, is that sometimes it's helpful to have someone kind of take over and do things for you. And so I feel like that's kind of like, oh, well, they're doing the thinking for you. Yeah, yes and no, but they should be kind of like walking you through the process and like, hey, this is why we're doing this week, to help you learn why you do things and how eventually you can get to a point where you can manipulate things on your own.
Yeah, and a big part of the reason why progress sometimes does take that 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks long is because of that learning curve. And like we said, tracking your macros forces you to learn about food. And so the first couple of weeks are usually, unless someone picks up on it pretty quickly or like has some knowledge reading food labels before, if they're coming from ground zero, they are not going to be perfectly consistent on week 1. More often than not, it takes 2, 3, 4 weeks for someone to actually be consistently nailing down their macros. And so when it comes to like seeing that progress, we have to have a certain level of consistency. And when someone says, oh, my body's not responding, maybe we need to change something. A lot of times in those situations, I'll take a look at that client's macro tracking adherence. It's like, oh, well, this day, and this day, you were over on your targets. So yeah, your weight didn't move because you weren't adherent. So just be adherent and we'll keep seeing progress. And so there's that learning curve at the beginning where you have to first figure out how to actually hit your targets. Most people don't get that far on their own. Like, to be perfectly honest, like most people say that they are tracking macros, but they're not consistent because they don't have the accountability to become consistent. And then once they reach one little roadblock, it's like, you need that oversight, like you said, to be able to objectively say, well, the reason why you didn't lose weight isn't because your body hates you. It's because you overshot your targets 3 out of 7 days. And we need more consistency than that. So absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that kind of wraps up macros. Obviously, Marissa and I are a little bit biased because that is the kind of main, I guess, tool that we use for strategy for our clients, and we have found that to be the most successful. But I think the other thing too, and we've kind of harped on this before, but if science, like if something else came out, a new strategy, and it was way more effective than macros, then I can guarantee Marissa and I would probably switch over to that method.
Yeah.
But for right now, this is what we have found to be the most successful for our clients and for ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. And that's just keeping a client-centered approach at the forefront, right? And just making sure we're doing what's best for you guys. And right now, that's where our opinion lies. But I think, we've kind of covered, okay, how do we handle macros rigidly? And how do we kind of handle them flexibly? And now moving from that flexible side of tracking macros into intuitive and or mindful eating. So I do want to just quickly make the disclaimer. If I'm going to say the words intuitive eating, you have to know what it is and what it's not. And technically, what most people talk about colloquially as intuitive eating isn't what it actually is clinically. So intuitive eating is a clinical nutritional practice that helps people who are overcoming eating disorders to get more in touch with their body. So that's not what we're talking about. When most people on the fitness Instagram space says intuitive eating, they're talking about probably eating something that looks like what they'd eat with macros, but without plugging it into an app. And so I think from this point on, I'm going to say a mindful eating framework or mindful eating, just to be like, just careful about my language with that, because those two definitions of intuitive eating often get confused. So I'll do my best with that, but it's really hard to not use the words intuitive eating. So just upfront, that is what it actually is. And that's not what we're talking about, because we don't treat eating disorders. But essentially just getting into, okay, well, what is mindful eating? And essentially it's exactly what I just said. It's what most people describe as intuitively managing their diet or mindfully eating is really just using the exact same principles, all the knowledge that they've learned through tracking macros to consistently manage their diet without having to be reliant on an app or a food scale. And that's ultimately where we all want to be. And so the main thing that I want to hit home here is, while we are big proponents of tracking your macros, again, it's not something that we want you to do for the rest of your life. And so ultimately it is a tool, and it is kind of a means to an end. And that end is being able to manage your weight without needing to plug things into an app, use a food scale, and just being able to exercise those principles on a regular and daily basis. And that's how we make this a truly sustainable lifestyle. So while I use tracking macros with clients, a lot of my process, I build in time to transition someone off of the numbers so that they can be successful long-term. Because if I leave them off, and I've done this in the past, if I've left someone off with, okay, you just lost 15 pounds with macros, congrats, okay, bye. What are they going to do when we end our contract? They're going to be like, oh, great, I don't have macros anymore. I'm free. I can, eat whatever I want. I'm off the plan. It's the same thing as a meal plan at that point. And so then they go back to all their old habits. But what we want, what it should teach you is, okay, let's do these same things, these behaviors, these habits, these choices that I'm making in order to hit my macros. We have to be able to step out from that box of the numbers and realize what it is we're actually doing with our behavior, and then replicate that with our quote unquote mindful eating practice.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'll do to kind of help my clients transition is I will say, okay, well, pick like a Wednesday and eat what you would normally eat that day, but just don't track it. So if you normally wake up and you have oatmeal, okay, well, make yourself a bowl of oatmeal, but just don't track, don't weigh everything out, but just kind of eyeball. And then go about your day and, see what happens and maybe do that like once or twice a week. The other thing that I'll do too sometimes is I'll weigh something out, but I'll weigh it out without looking at the scale and kind of see like how close I was to what I wanted. So that way you kind of start to trust your intuition and kind of have a better feel for, okay, I probably could eyeball this meal and have a pretty accurate idea or description of what these numbers are. So I think that that's kind of a way, if you don't feel 100% comfortable just saying, well, I'm going to throw my scale away. You just kind of tuck it away and still have it there as like not a crutch, but if you need to revert back to it, but just kind of starting that, or maybe you could even do taking, and I've done this too, where you have a client who tracks throughout the day. And then when they have dinner, maybe just don't track dinner, but again, eat what you would normally eat, but just kind of eyeball and look at portions and be able to make those decisions without being like, well, I'm not tracking. So instead of having like, my portioned out like sweet potato fries, I'm going to pour the whole bag in, things like that. So you're still exercising that flexible restraint, but it's just not as rigid and you don't need to use a scale.
Yeah, I do pretty much the exact same thing. Sometimes with clients who maybe have been really rigid with themselves in the past and really struggle with the idea of letting go of numbers, because that can be super common too, because a lot of us, like, we want to cling on to macros because it's like, this is our safety net now. Like, I understand how this works. When I'm hitting my targets, things work. When I don't hit my targets, things don't work. And we develop that association very strongly too. So breaking free of that is a lot harder of a process than one might think. And so sometimes I'll even have like 1 or 2 days a week where I'll say, okay, on this day, random Wednesday, I want you to plug everything into MyFitnessPal the same way you normally would, but I want you to forego the food scale. So you're basically doing one thing, but not the other. And then I'll have them on another day. Maybe it's a Thursday, Tuesday, Monday, whatever. I don't like doing it on the weekends because it's just, weekends are different. But like, let's pick another weekday here and let's use the food scale for all of your portions, but don't plug anything into the app. And I'll actually have them do both of those two things in 1 week. And I'll say, okay, now which one was harder for you? Like, is it the issue of not seeing the fact that you have hit your targets, or is it the unconfidence of like not knowing if you have weighed out everything appropriately? And so we can kind of go with that. We can say, okay, well, which one was more challenging? Okay, let's work on that one, and we'll do more practice with verifying that you can eyeball properly, or maybe more practice with just knowing that you don't need to have an app telling you that you're successful with your choices. And so a lot of it is building confidence. So I'll use kind of that stepwise approach. And then, maybe we get into the weekends and we say, okay, well, weekend habits are different than weekday habits, right? Because we can't do exactly what we do on a weekday on the weekend because we sleep in and then we have social plans and then all of this stuff. So instead, let's set some realistic targets here. If we're going to manage this day mindfully or intuitively, then let's set some targets of, okay, well, let's get in half a gallon of water by a certain time. Let's make sure we hit a training session over the weekend. Let's make sure that we are managing our hunger and our fullness cues so that we don't get too hungry and we don't get too full. So something that kind of just rubs me wrong is like, if someone asks, okay, well, I'm cool with this tracking macros thing, but like, I just want to be more flexible on the weekends. So can I just take the days off on the weekends? And like, that's where we just spin our wheels and we don't make any progress. So really, it's about transitioning off, in my opinion, during those comfort in routine weekdays, and then working the weekends. And once we've become confident with that, okay, maybe you have a meal out on the weekend, maybe you track everything leading up to that. And then we focus on managing portion control at that dinner. Or maybe continue to use macros on the weekends to hold yourself accountable, but maybe you're transitioned off of it on the weekdays. So kind of like a reverse, but really figuring out what is the right balance for each person in terms of how much you're doing intuitively, mindfully, without numbers, and how much you are still using numbers. And one thing you did mention, it's not a crutch to use a food scale. And I often encourage, like, you don't ever have to throw that out. Like a food scale is a normal kitchen tool. Like people use it to measure out, like weigh their coffee if they're making like a pour over, like that stuff is normal. It's not like the weirdest thing in the world anymore to weigh out a portion size. So I encourage, if you need that there, or you not need, if you want that there, you can still use it, even if you're not plugging anything into MyFitnessPal. It can be a tool that still sits in your kitchen, even after, say, our contract ends, or your diet ends. It is still a tool in your tool belt that you can whip out at any time. Same thing with tracking macros. If you feel like you're starting to get off track and you're not tracking food actively, you can always plug in a couple of days and be like, oh, this is why I feel the way that I feel. Let me get these habits back on course.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I will have some clients who maybe will transition from not tracking everything to only tracking things like peanut butter, or tracking like high calorie items, just to make sure that they're staying within like portion sizes. So you can kind of do that. And so I think that when it comes to like this intuitive eating, mindful eating, it's trying to trying to figure out what works best for you. But I mean, I know I say it all the time, but it is really true, because something that Marissa finds that she can do may not be what works for my lifestyle. And so it really is trying to find those habits that are realistic for you and you feel like you can implement for a long period of time.
Yeah, I think one of the final things too, when it comes to mindfully eating, like I said, you need that knowledge base first, in order to actually make informed decisions on your food. Because how are you supposed to know how much meat, like lean protein, that you need to trade off for the fatty protein that you had earlier, if you don't understand what portion sizes look like and what kind of fat content is in those foods in the first place, right? So like Christina said, you get this oddly accurate, like knowledge base, like encyclopedia basically, of, oh, well, I know that 40 grams of oatmeal is 3 fat and 27 carbs and 5 protein. And like that has been in my head for years, and I've always known that. But like, yeah, so that's something that first you need. But also, okay, well, where does the mindful part come into this? It comes in with, okay, well, how do I actually listen to my body? Because the other trap that we can fall into with tracking macros is eating if we're not hungry, or not eating if we are hungry, and basically ignoring those signals to hit our targets when we have a specific goal. Especially if you are cutting or bulking, you are intentionally ignoring hunger and fullness signals, because you are trying to either lose body weight or push your body weight up. Both require some amount of forced eating or forced not eating. And so basically we can really get away from those signals when we track macros. And especially if we're not good about like meal timing with macros, this is where we can kind of take it to one extreme of like, oh shit, I forgot to eat all day long. Let me just get in all of my macros at 9 p.m. That's not a good habit that we want to build. But I know people that do that, and they get like, basically they don't really eat until dinner time, and then they just hoard it all. We don't want to do that, because then we're really just overriding those cues. But ultimately, our bodies do know how much food we need. And when we start to get back into this mindful eating framework, we have to start to trust that, listen to that, and really pay attention to it. So a lot of things that I like to use now include just, taking our time eating, like going back to the basics, like drinking water throughout the day to manage your appetite, spacing out your meals appropriately, slowing down when you're chewing and eating, not eating distracted. And then one thing that I really like to use with clients is called the hunger fullness Likert scale. So it's literally just a one, well, I've seen it as a 1 to 7 and a 1 to 10. I use the 1 to 10, and it's basically a scale of how hungry are you? How full are you? 10 is I'm so stuffed, I feel sick, I want to throw up. 1 is I feel like my stomach is eating itself. and I'm going to die. And basically, what you want to try to do when you're mindfully eating is stay between like a 4 and a 6. Like if you're aiming for weight maintenance, if you stay in that range, like you're not so hungry that like you feel like you're going to rip someone's arm off, and you're not so full that like you're starting to feel uncomfortable. If you consistently stay in that tight range, you will achieve weight maintenance because your body knows what it wants and you'll find your set point there. And so that's really hard to do, but that is one tool that I use when I'm trying to help someone get back in touch with those signals.
Yeah, I think that's really, really great and such a great tool because again, it's like you might think, well, oh, I really want this whole pizza. Well, are you going to be at a 10? Like, are you going to feel super uncomfortable and then not good? You're like mentally and physically after eating all of it. And because I think that sometimes intuitive eating and mindful eating, people think it's just a term for eating whatever you want at any time that you want. And just it's like the ultimate food freedom. And so, again, a lot of people who follow this still implement those healthy habits that they've picked up from macro tracking. And so it's kind of like Marissa was saying, like, oh, okay, well, if I need to get in a workout, then my pre-meal should be a little bit heavier in carbs, lower in fat, same thing post-workout. And then maybe throughout the day, I'm having moderate carbs because I know a big chunk of that was surrounding my workout. So just small things like that. And then just remembering, oh, okay, I should have a protein source that kind of is the center of all of my meals. And I should maybe have like a protein shake at the end of the night or something like that. So you're still being mindful, you're still implementing those healthy habits, but it's just with a little bit more freedom.
Yeah, I mean, and we have to, right? Because ultimately, what we want is a lifestyle change. And so, what we really want to do, what that end goal is for most people, I'm not going to speak for everyone, but for most people, we want to mesh the best aspects of macro tracking. So, like knowing exactly what's in our food, what portions, and what portions are right for us. We want to mesh some of those aspects in from meal plans, like eating lots of fruits and vegetables, eating nutrient dense food sources and limiting processed food sources, and eating stuff that makes us feel good. And then we want to mesh in the hunger fullness scale, listening to our bodies and really honoring that. If we can take the best of all three of those approaches, that's the end goal for most people. We're not reliant on anything. We're making autonomous, informed choices that we feel good about. And ultimately, from those choices, we're able to better conduct ourselves through a healthy lifestyle, most likely achieve weight maintenance or be able to manage our weight with our own knowledge, and overall just live a sustainable, that is what a sustainable lifestyle really looks like.
Right. And I think the other thing too, and we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, but just kind of figuring out what your goals are and what's going to be the best approach to you being able to hit your goals. So for me personally, if I was going to cut or if I was going to start a contest prep, well, I'm going to start macro tracking and I might eventually move to a meal plan so I don't have to think about my food choices. And that's going to help me reach my goals. But if I am in this like maintenance phase, or if I'm bulking and I can just again have that freedom, then I might do like, you know, that more intuitive eating, mindful eating method, and know that I don't have to be as strict because I don't have very specific goals. So again, it's like what your goals are and what's the best method to reach them.
And spoiler alert, intuitively cutting is an awful idea.
It's hard. Some people can do it, but it is hard.
I just it just doesn't make any sense. Like if you're going to starve yourself, at least do it knowledgeably, because most of the time you get to eat more when you track macros than if you were to just say I'm going to be at a 3 on the hunger scale all the time. That sounds miserable.
Yeah. So I will say though that Lauren Conlin is one of those people who I've seen. She did start and kind of document like an intuitive eating cut. And I think again, it's because she is a coach. She has so much
Yes.
knowledge. And so she might be able to eyeball portion sizes. And she has that background with tracking that allows her to do that. So if you're new, intuitive cutting or intuitive eating may not be the best method for you at this current moment, but that doesn't mean that you can't work your way towards that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, she's also what, like contest prepped a billion times too. So like
Yeah,
she knows what those meals should look like. But
right.
yeah, but really just advising for the layperson who's listening and maybe doesn't have the best knowledge base, don't fall victim to that shit, please.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that was a really good summary of all of them. I don't think I have anything else to add.
Yeah, no, that was a great, I mean, compared, contrast all of them and then really tied them all together at the end too.
Yeah. And again, Marissa and I are biased with tracking macros, but only because we've found it to be the most effective. And if there was another method of eating that came up and was, way more effective for our clients, then we would shift over to that. So it's not like we are focused on macros and we think that that is the only way, because again, sometimes we get clients who may not be able to track their macros, and we might just say, okay, well, let's focus on just hitting protein, or like let's just focus on these healthy habits, and eventually maybe you can take on a few more. But what works for one client may not work for another, so just trying to find what's best for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, guys, we hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. And you can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit, and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.